So, what was it like working with Mark Lanegan as a vocalist?
Well, I think the longer he sang, the more he figured out what he could do with that bass register, that low tenor thing. That's kind of his signature now.
Did you ever double his voice?
A lot of the time, yeah. He chewed tobacco.
As he was singing?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And it was always hard to make his voice read against all those guitar overdubs. Mark learned the hard way that if you leave Lee on his own, he'll just do guitar overdubs. By the time we got to mixing the Invisible Lantern record, Mark was like, what? Like, no.
That's funny.
He was at home in his low octave, which hadn't really blossomed yet. Mark Lanegan, as we know him now, you can start to hear, that thing kind of jump out where the screams all land, and when he goes for a big note, he's got the right lyric and the right turn and the right push behind it. There was a couple of moments where I went like, oh shit, he's really turning into something really wonderful, and he was always good, and he was always lyric and melodic. If he wasn't happy, then the whole vibe got just, then there was no vibe, and you were just trying to make Mark happy. But Mark was also in a lot of physical pain, and he had really bad headaches, and he was totally sober the whole time. It's none of my fucking business, but when you're making a complete commitment to doing psychedelic records, I was the only guy that smoked pot. Nobody smoked pot. A couple of guys in the band drank a little bit, but Mark was serious about doing it. I mean, and we went through a kind of a sound search on his voice and played with different kinds of compression and turning off compression. So no, there was a whole very concerted effort. We started with this Neumann because it was the best, that KM84 I was telling you about earlier. I think that's the vocal mic on Other Worlds and Clairvoyance, and eventually we switched over to an SM58, which is kind of a pedestrian microphone, but it's a great microphone to scream into. I know you've had a whole video about Kurt Cobain screaming in microphones and all of that, but Mudhoney, we're using SM58s. Everybody's using SM58s, so we just quit fucking around with trying to do something high quality or fancy and just use an SM58. So yeah, Invisible Lantern and even if and especially when, or just Mark singing into a mic on a stand. One of the other things you got to think about too is when you have an 8-track, that means at a certain point you have to erase the scratch vocal. There's no way to save the scratch vocal. And even though the sound was shitty and there was tons of bleed, Mark Lanegan's scratch vocals were so good. And I would try to talk him out of it, but there wasn't like any fancy digital thing where you could bounce it off someplace with the idea that eventually you'd figure out some way to use it or something like that. And it didn't sound anything like a real vocal because it had guitars and cymbals and everything in it. But Mark Lanegan's scratch vocals, he delivered on every fucking take. There wasn't a scratch vocal that wasn't as good as it could get. As somebody who later really learned how to recognize a good take, the idea that there aren't any live Mark Lanegan takes from that whole period of our work with him, I'm just embarrassed. That's just stupid. But that's just the reality of it. And then it's also, that's working with an artist and understanding is like, there's no way I'm putting that vocal out,
I hear you. So I mean,
erase it,
So would he be the kind of person that he would sing like 15, 20 minutes, take a break and come back? Or would he be one of the guys that would go for like 2 hours straight? Like what was he like in that regard?
I think we had evenings where we just sang vocals, 4 hours of singing, 3 hours of singing. It was just like at a certain point, there was just sort of a workman, thing. We're like, all right, we've done all the guitars, let's do all the vocals. I didn't know anything about different kinds of singers. I hadn't learned fuck, so I learned a lot about recording vocals working with Lanegan, and I think we tried all kinds of things, Remember there was one song, I forgot which one it was. I'm pretty sure it was an Invisible Lantern song where Mark didn't want to finish it or didn't want to finish writing the words or something. Forget what the thing was, and he made like a whole party out of it where it says, okay, Rod Doak, the sound like, you go sing it now. Okay, Lee, you sing it now. And Lee would go out and do his version of it, and we make a mix of that. And it says, okay, Fisk, you go out and sing it now. So there's this one song that's got And there's this cassette of it somewhere. Maybe it's gone by now, but it's just me doing all these rough mixes of like these, and everybody in the studio sang the song because Mark was just having fun, kind of not finishing the vocal.
That's funny.
You know?
So in general, like how many takes would you get for his vocals? Like would you do a lot of takes or just not that many?
It seemed to go well. He was never like, hey, I just nailed that. You know, he's not that kind of guy. So even when it was great, he still had all kinds of misgivings, but he could walk away from it going, that's as good as it's going to get tonight. Neither of us knew what we were doing. You know, we figured out in SM58, and I think there was an old Symmetrix 522 compressor. He just did a great job of figuring out his shit. And it was by, you know, a lot of learn by, you know, by doing kind of thing, you know. So he, a lot of shit was good enough, but, you know, for him, you know, he's got a kind of a relentless thing about perfection and all of that. So I think that drove him to, you know, do all this other, you know, God, it's really inaccurate, really, really badly worded. But, you know, what he turned into was because he wasn't happy with what he was. And without getting into the book, but the idea that he was saddled with doing this kind of genre music, you know, the psychedelic thing, you know, it's like he loved it, he dug it, but like all the Screaming Trees, he listened to tons of music. So the idea that he doesn't want to talk about, you know, the old stuff or play the old songs or anything like that, I mean, that makes complete sense. You know, it was where he landed, it's how he got started, but, you know, I don't think it was his first love.
Yeah, fair enough.
And in a small town, you know, there's not another band, you know, so I think, you know, he loved all these guys, but, you know, wasn't necessarily, you know, a good fit from the beginning, you know. And then you go to Seattle, and then you're in the goddamn 90s, you know, and you're from Eastern Washington, so you're not part of, you know, the UW hipster thing or the North End metal thing or any of this shit. So they're outsiders in the middle of this thing that's incredibly political and high pressure and weird, and surprised they got to be friends with Nirvana. Also the Hicks from the middle of nowhere, you know.
And maybe that's why they connected, you know?
Yeah.